The most dangerous thief is never the stranger outside your door. It is the friend who already has a key. I did not lose my company because I was careless. I lost it because I trusted the one person I believed would always protect it with me. My name is Ethan Carter, and for nearly 20 years, Ryan Mitchell was more than my best friend. He was my brother in every way that mattered. We met during freshman orientation at the University of Michigan after accidentally reaching for the same stale slice of pizza at a student event. He laughed first, offered me the slice, and somehow that tiny moment became the beginning of a friendship that shaped both of our lives. We graduated together, rented a tiny apartment with peeling paint and unreliable heat, and dreamed about building something that would matter. We worked every job we could find while spending our nights designing software on 2 secondhand laptops balanced on an old folding table. Some weeks we survived on instant noodles and gas station coffee, because every extra dollar went into our business. We promised each other that if success ever came, neither of us would forget where we started. 5 years later, our tiny startup became Carter and Mitchell Solutions. We focused on cybersecurity for small businesses, a market that larger firms ignored. One satisfied client became 10. 10 became 100. Before long, we had a modern headquarters outside Chicago, nearly 200 employees, an annual revenue that still felt unbelievable every time I saw the financial reports. Whenever reporters asked how we built such a successful company, Ryan always smiled and said, "We never forgot that friendship comes before business." Every audience loved that answer. So did I. Looking back now, I wonder if he had already started practicing the lie. Ryan stood beside me through every important moment of my adult life. He was the best man at my wedding. He held my newborn daughter before most of my relatives did. Every Thanksgiving, our families gathered around the same dinner table. My wife, Claire, called him Uncle Ryan because our daughter insisted that was what he should be. When his father passed away unexpectedly, I canceled an investor meeting without hesitation and spent 3 days helping his family organize everything. When my mother needed emergency surgery, Ryan practically lived at the hospital waiting room beside me. We were not simply business partners. We were family. At least, that was what I believed. As the company grew, I naturally shifted toward product development while Ryan handled daily operations. It seemed like the perfect arrangement because he genuinely enjoyed meetings, negotiations, and managing executives while I preferred creating new technology. Every major decision still required both of us, and neither of us questioned the other. If Ryan said a contract needed my signature, I signed it after reading it carefully because I trusted both the documents and the man handing them to me. Trust became our greatest strength. It also became the weakness neither of us ever acknowledged. About 6 months before everything fell apart, subtle changes began appearing around Ryan. He bought a larger house across the lake, started flying first class even on short business trips, and surrounded himself with consultants I had never met. Whenever I asked about the increased spending, he brushed it off with a confident smile and said the company needed to project success to attract bigger clients. His explanations always sounded reasonable, and I had no reason to doubt him. After all, Ryan had earned my trust thousands of times before. Then one Friday afternoon, he stepped into my office carrying a slim leather folder. He looked relaxed, almost cheerful, and placed the paperwork on my desk. "Nothing exciting," he said with a grin. "Just some restructuring documents our attorneys recommended before the next funding round. Standard corporate housekeeping." I glanced at the stack, saw familiar legal language, and reached for my pen while Ryan leaned comfortably against the doorway, smiling like the same friend who had once shared that last slice of pizza with me. I had absolutely no idea that the signature I was about to write would become the first step toward losing everything I had spent 20 years building. The following Monday began like every other workday I had lived for nearly 2 decades. I left home just before 7:30 in the morning, grabbed my usual black coffee from the cafe across the street, and drove toward our headquarters while listening to a local business podcast that I barely paid attention to. My calendar showed a product review meeting at 9 o'clock followed by lunch with 2 potential clients. Nothing felt unusual. Nothing warned me that my entire life was about to change before breakfast. As I turned into the company parking garage, I noticed the security gate remained closed longer than usual. The guard looked at his monitor, frowned, and stepped out of the booth. He apologized politely and told me my employee badge had been deactivated overnight. I laughed, assuming the information technology department had made another software update. The guard forced a nervous smile, but did not laugh with me. He asked me to wait while he made a phone call. 10 uncomfortable minutes later, another security supervisor arrived and explained that he had received instructions not to allow me into the building until human resources confirmed my status. I stared at him, convinced there had been some ridiculous misunderstanding. I introduced myself even though we had spoken dozens of times before. He already knew exactly who I was. That made the conversation even stranger. Finally, my phone buzzed. Ryan had sent a short text message. "Come to conference room B. We need to talk." Relief washed over me. Whatever this was, Ryan would clear it up in 5 minutes. He always did. The security supervisor escorted me through the lobby instead of allowing me to walk in freely. Employees looked up from their desks as we passed. Some smiled awkwardly before immediately looking back at their computer screens. Others avoided eye contact completely. I could feel the atmosphere changing around me, but I still refused to believe anything serious was happening. Conference room B overlooked the Chicago skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Ryan stood beside the table with 3 attorneys I recognized from outside law firms. Our chief financial officer sat quietly at the far end of the room, unable to meet my eyes. Ryan did not smile this time. He gestured toward the empty chair across from him. I remained standing. "What is going on?" I asked. Ryan folded his hands together as though he had rehearsed every word. "Ethan, after reviewing the restructuring process, the board has decided it is in the company's best interest for new leadership to move forward." I laughed again because the sentence sounded so absurd. "Very funny. Now tell me what is actually happening." Nobody laughed. One attorney slid a thick folder across the polished table. Inside were corporate resolutions, ownership records, and signed documents that appeared to transfer controlling authority away from me. My own signature appeared on several pages. Ryan spoke calmly, almost gently. "According to these agreements, you voluntarily approved the transition last week." My heartbeat accelerated. Transition to what? Ryan looked directly into my eyes and answered without emotion. "You no longer control Carter and Mitchell Solutions." For several seconds I could not process the words. They felt disconnected from reality, like hearing someone describe another person's life. I reached for the documents, flipping through page after page. The signatures looked authentic because they were mine. Dates matched. Initials matched. Legal language surrounded every page. My hands began shaking. This cannot be right. One attorney explained that the restructuring had been reviewed and approved according to company procedures. Another informed me that all executive access had already been updated over the weekend. My email account had been disabled. My company credit cards were inactive. My access to financial systems had been removed. Even my office keys no longer worked. I looked toward our chief financial officer, expecting him to object, to say there had been some mistake, but he simply lowered his head. Ryan sighed as though this conversation exhausted him. "Please do not make this harder than it needs to be. You signed the paperwork. Everyone has accepted the transition. The company needs stability." Stability. The word echoed inside my head. 20 years of sacrifice reduced to a single corporate buzzword. I walked out of the conference room, carrying nothing except the folder they had handed me. As the elevator doors closed, I saw familiar employees pretending not to watch me leave. By the time I reached the parking garage, my company phone had already stopped working. I sat inside my car for nearly an hour, staring at the steering wheel, trying to remember every page I had signed the previous Friday. Somewhere inside that stack of ordinary-looking paperwork, my entire future had disappeared, and for the first time since Ryan and I met as college students, I realized that the man I trusted more than anyone else might have been planning this long before I ever picked up my pen. I drove home carrying nothing except the folder that supposedly proved I had signed away the company I had spent half my life building. Claire met me at the front door before I even reached for my keys. She had called my office several times that afternoon, but every number she tried had gone straight to voicemail. One look at my face told her something was terribly wrong. I spread the documents across our dining room table while explaining everything exactly as it had happened. She listened without interrupting until I finished. Then she quietly asked the question I had been avoiding. "Did you actually sign these?" I looked at every page again. Every signature belonged to me. Every initial looked genuine. Every date matched my memory of the previous Friday. "Yes," I admitted. "I signed them. I just never believed they meant this." Claire reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She did not tell me everything would be fine because neither of us believed that anymore. The next morning, I contacted the first corporate attorney recommended by an old client. He reviewed the documents for nearly 3 hours before leaning back in his chair with a tired expression. Mr. Carter, based on what I see here, the paperwork appears properly executed. If your signatures are authentic, challenging this will be extremely difficult. I left his office with less hope than when I had entered. Over the next 2 weeks, I met with 4 more attorneys. Every conversation followed the same pattern. They sympathized with my situation, carefully reviewed the agreements, then gently explained that courts generally respected signed corporate documents unless clear evidence of fraud existed. One lawyer even advised me to negotiate a financial settlement instead of fighting. Another suggested I walk away entirely before legal expenses consumed whatever savings I still had. Their opinions were professional and logical, but each one felt like another door closing in front of me. News traveled faster than I expected. Industry blogs reported that Carter and Mitchell Solutions had completed a leadership transition designed to position the company for aggressive expansion. Several articles praised Ryan as a visionary executive ready to lead the next chapter. My own name appeared only briefly, described as a founder who had chosen to step away from daily operations. I stared at those headlines in disbelief. They made it sound as though I had happily retired. Former colleagues stopped returning my calls. Some probably feared choosing the wrong side. Others likely believed the official story because it was simpler than imagining something darker had happened behind closed doors. My calendar, once filled weeks in advance, became completely empty. Even people I had mentored for years suddenly became impossible to reach. One afternoon, I visited a small coffee shop where several employees usually met after work. As I stepped inside, conversations immediately grew quieter. Nobody was openly rude. They simply looked uncomfortable, as though speaking to me might somehow threaten their own careers. I smiled, wished everyone well, and left with my untouched cup of coffee. The silence hurt far more than anger ever could. Meanwhile, Ryan seemed to be everywhere. Business magazines featured his interviews. Social media displayed photographs of him shaking hands with investors and speaking at conferences. Every article described him as the driving force behind the company's remarkable future. Watching those interviews felt surreal because I recognized so many ideas as conversations we had shared years earlier in my garage. He repeated our dreams almost word for word, except now he spoke as though they had always belonged to him alone. The hardest moment came one Friday evening when my daughter asked why Uncle Ryan had not answered her birthday invitation. She was too young to understand corporate betrayal or legal documents. She only knew that someone she loved had disappeared without explanation. I told her that adults sometimes made choices that children could not yet understand. As I said the words, I realized I could not understand those choices either. Days turned into weeks. My confidence slowly dissolved into exhaustion. Every path seemed blocked. Every fact pointed toward the same conclusion. Ryan had outplanned me. The board supported him. The lawyers believed the documents. The public accepted the story. Even I could not explain how everything had unraveled so completely. Then, on a rainy Saturday afternoon, Claire suggested we finally clean out the old storage unit we had rented years earlier when the company first moved into its headquarters. Neither of us expected to find anything valuable. Most of it contained outdated computers, faded marketing materials, and boxes we had not opened in more than a decade. I almost canceled the trip because it felt pointless, but staying home meant thinking about everything I had lost. I unlocked the dusty metal door, switched on the single hanging light bulb, and stepped into a room filled with forgotten pieces of our past, never imagining that one forgotten memory hidden somewhere inside those old boxes would soon make me question everything I thought I knew about the papers Ryan had placed in front of me. The storage unit smelled like old cardboard, dust, and forgotten ambitions. Claire began sorting through faded photo albums while I opened plastic containers filled with cables, hard drives, and equipment we had not touched since our first office expansion nearly 15 years earlier. Most of it belonged in the recycling bin. I almost closed the last metal cabinet without looking inside because it contained nothing more than cracked binders and outdated employee manuals. Then something familiar caught my attention. A black leather notebook rested beneath a stack of old accounting folders. The edges were worn smooth from years of use. I recognized it instantly. During our first 5 years in business, I had carried that notebook everywhere. Every investor meeting, every client pitch, every major decision had been recorded inside its pages because we could not afford expensive legal software back then. I flipped through pages filled with handwritten notes, rough sketches, meeting dates, and reminders that brought back memories of a much simpler time. Tucked inside the back cover was a small envelope labeled Original Corporate Documents Backup. My heart skipped for the first time in weeks. I had completely forgotten creating it. Before cloud storage became common, I had made physical copies of our earliest legal paperwork in case anything happened to the originals. Inside the envelope were scanned copies of our founding agreement, early shareholder records, and several corporate resolutions signed during our first years. Most of the papers had little value anymore because the company had changed dramatically since then. Still, curiosity kept me turning each page. Then I reached a copy of our original operating agreement. A sentence highlighted in yellow caught my attention. It read, "Any transfer of founder-controlling interest shall require written approval executed in accordance with Article 12. I frowned. Article 12. I did not remember exactly what it contained. The scanned copy was too blurry to read the fine print, so I searched through another binder until I found an older printed version of the complete agreement. Claire noticed my expression changing and walked over quietly. Together we found Article 12. It was only 3 short paragraphs, but one sentence immediately stood out. Any transaction permanently transferring the controlling founder interest shall require the original written signature of the controlling founder on the final execution page, retained within the official corporate record. I read the sentence 3 times, then 4. Something about those exact words refused to leave my mind. Original written signature. Final execution page. Official corporate record. Suddenly, I remembered the folder Ryan had placed in front of me only weeks earlier. I remembered signing multiple pages quickly after reviewing summaries we had discussed. But for reasons I could not explain, I could not picture signing a final execution page matching the language described in Article 12. Memory is dangerous because it can become whatever we want it to be, so I forced myself not to jump to conclusions. Claire looked at me carefully. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am not sure," I answered honestly. "I just remember signing documents. I do not remember signing what this clause describes." She did not celebrate or suggest we had found the answer. Instead, she simply said, "Then prove your memory wrong before you believe it is right." It was exactly what I needed to hear. That evening, I spread every copy of the restructuring documents across our dining room table beside the older corporate agreements. For nearly 4 hours, I compared page numbers, formatting, signature blocks, and references. Everything appeared professionally prepared. Everything looked legitimate. Yet one small detail kept bothering me. The restructuring packet repeatedly referred to resolutions approved under the operating agreement, but nowhere in my personal copies could I find a page clearly identified as the final execution page required under Article 12. Perhaps it existed somewhere else. Perhaps I had overlooked it completely. Or perhaps something far more important had been overlooked by someone else. I refused to let hope cloud my judgment. Too many lawyers had already told me the case was impossible. If I wanted answers, assumptions would not be enough. I needed facts that could survive scrutiny in a courtroom. As I carefully returned the old documents to their folders, my phone vibrated with a message from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. "You are looking in the right place, but you are still missing the page that matters." I stared at the anonymous message for nearly a full minute before showing it to Claire. There was no name, no phone number, and no additional information. By the time I tried calling back, the number no longer existed. Whoever had sent it clearly did not want to be found. Under normal circumstances, I would have dismissed it as a cruel prank, but the timing was too precise. No one except Claire knew I had reopened those old corporate records. Somehow, someone else knew exactly where I was looking. Instead of chasing the mystery, I decided to follow the only path that still made sense. Facts first, questions later. The next morning, I contacted a different attorney, one whose name had never appeared on our company's legal correspondence. Margaret Holloway had spent nearly 30 years specializing in corporate governance disputes and was known for refusing cases she believed could not survive in court. During our first meeting, I did not tell her what I hoped had happened. I simply handed her every document I possessed including the original operating agreement from the storage unit and the restructuring papers Ryan had used against me. She spent almost an hour reading in complete silence. When she finally looked up, she did not tell me I would win. She did not even say I had a case. Instead, she asked a single question. Do you have access to the company's official corporate records? I laughed bitterly. Ryan made sure I have access to nothing. She nodded thoughtfully. Then we do not guess. We verify. Within days, she assembled a small team consisting of a forensic document examiner, a corporate records specialist, and a forensic accountant. None of them promised miracles. Their job was simple. Compare every document, every signature, every filing date, every resolution, and every procedural requirement until every fact either supported or destroyed my suspicions. I appreciated their approach because emotion had already failed me. Evidence was all that mattered now. While the legal team quietly worked, I deliberately stayed out of the public eye. I did not post on social media. I did not contact former employees. I did not respond to reporters asking for comments about the leadership transition. Ryan seemed perfectly comfortable filling that silence himself. Business magazines praised his vision. Podcasts invited him to discuss entrepreneurship. He announced an ambitious expansion plan into 3 additional states and proudly unveiled a renovated executive floor that had once been my responsibility. Investors applauded every announcement. Watching from a distance was painful, but Margaret repeatedly reminded me that impatience often destroys stronger cases than bad evidence ever could. If he believes the story is over, she said, he becomes less careful. 2 weeks into the investigation, the forensic accountant requested every public filing related to the restructuring. Annual reports, state registrations, financing agreements, and shareholder disclosures covered an entire conference table. One pattern immediately stood out. Ryan had moved unusually fast. Within only a few weeks of removing me, he had signed multiple long-term financing agreements, approved major executive bonuses, negotiated new investor commitments, and personally authorized several corporate restructuring actions worth millions of dollars. Margaret smiled for the first time since we met. It was not a smile of victory. It was the smile of someone noticing a possibility. Interesting, she whispered. I leaned forward. What does that mean? She closed one folder and looked directly at me. If the foundation supporting his authority is defective, every major action built on that foundation becomes vulnerable. That does not prove anything yet, but it raises the stakes considerably. Days later, the forensic document examiner completed his preliminary comparison. He found no obvious evidence that my signatures had been forged. That result should have disappointed me, yet strangely it did not. I had never believed Ryan needed to fake my handwriting. He had always preferred convincing people to sign willingly. The real question had never been whether I signed documents. The question was whether I had signed every document legally required to transfer permanent control. Late one Thursday afternoon, Margaret received a response to a formal records request submitted through a shareholder rights provision that had somehow survived the restructuring. She carefully opened the envelope while everyone in the conference room watched without speaking. Inside was an index listing every official corporate record maintained by the company. She slowly turned each page until her finger stopped on one specific entry. She read the description twice before looking up at me. Ethan, she said quietly, according to the official index, there is supposed to be a separately archived final execution page for the founder transfer resolution. The index says it exists. Now we have to find out whether anyone can actually produce it. The official records request changed everything, but not in the way I expected. For the first time since losing the company, we had something concrete instead of assumptions. An indexed corporate record was not a rumor. It was a legal obligation. If the final execution page truly existed, Ryan's attorneys would eventually have to produce it. If it did not exist, then someone would have to explain why the official record claimed otherwise. Margaret immediately warned me not to celebrate. This is only the beginning, she said. The worst mistake people make is believing they have won before the other side even realizes the game has changed. I followed her advice. Instead of filing a lawsuit immediately, we quietly continued gathering evidence, while Ryan moved forward with remarkable confidence. From the outside, Carter and Mitchell Solutions appeared stronger than ever. Local newspapers praised the company's aggressive expansion strategy. Industry magazines featured Ryan on their covers beneath headlines calling him one of the Midwest's fastest rising executives. He appeared at business conferences wearing tailored suits, smiling for photographers, and speaking about innovation, leadership, and corporate culture. Every interview made him look more successful than the last. Watching those appearances no longer filled me with anger. Instead, I found myself studying every announcement carefully. Margaret had explained that every major decision Ryan signed as chief executive officer could become legally significant later. The more authority he exercised, the more documents he personally approved. The more documents he approved, the larger the legal consequences could become if his authority was ever questioned. It felt strange hoping he would continue making decisions, but that was exactly what our legal team wanted. Every contract became another piece of a timeline. Every executive approval became another dated record. Every public statement reinforced that Ryan alone was acting as the company's controlling founder. 3 weeks later, Margaret received another response from the company's attorneys. This time they provided copies of additional restructuring documents, but carefully avoided including the separately archived execution page referenced in the official corporate index. Instead, they claimed all relevant materials had already been delivered. Margaret quietly placed the response beside the index listing. The contradiction was obvious. One document acknowledged the existence of a separately archived page. The other implied no additional records existed. She circled both statements with a red pen before looking at me. Someone is hoping we do not notice the difference. Rather than accusing anyone of misconduct, Margaret submitted another narrow request asking for only one specific document identified by its archive number. The request contained no arguments, no accusations, and no legal threats. Just a simple request for a record that, according to the company's own filing system, should have been easy to locate. Then we waited. Days passed without a response. Meanwhile, Ryan announced another major acquisition involving a regional cybersecurity consulting firm. Television cameras captured him ringing the ceremonial opening bell at a local business exchange. Investors applauded. Employees celebrated online. Former colleagues shared photographs congratulating him on the company's continued growth. Claire watched one interview with me before turning off the television. "He looks completely certain nothing can touch him," she said quietly. I nodded. "That is exactly what worries me." Margaret disagreed. "Confidence is useful," she replied. "Overconfidence is expensive." A week later, we finally received another letter from opposing counsel. This one was noticeably shorter than the previous responses. Instead of providing the requested archive page, they stated that they were continuing their search through historical corporate records and would respond when the document became available. Margaret read the letter twice before smiling slightly. If the page were sitting in a file cabinet, we would already have it. I felt my pulse quicken. "You think they cannot find it?" She shook her head carefully. "I do not know whether they cannot find it or whether it never existed. Those are very different possibilities. We do not assume either one. We keep asking questions until only one answer remains." That evening, as I organized our growing collection of documents at home, I noticed something I had overlooked before. Every restructuring page I had signed carried a consistent document identification number in the lower right corner. Every page except one. The numbering sequence skipped directly from page 47 to page 49. At first glance, it looked insignificant, the kind of printing error nobody would notice. Then I remembered the words from the anonymous message that had arrived weeks earlier. "You are still missing the page that matters." I slowly placed my finger between the two numbered pages and looked across the table at Claire. There was only one place where page 48 could have belonged. The missing page became the center of everything. Margaret instructed everyone on the legal team to stop treating it as a simple filing error and begin treating it as the key document in the entire restructuring. We created a timeline showing every page number, every archive reference, every signature, and every filing date connected to the transfer of control. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every supporting document existed. Every approval record existed. Every board resolution existed. Yet the one page that the operating agreement specifically required as the final execution page remained missing. More importantly, no one could produce an original copy despite multiple formal requests. Margaret requested one final meeting with the company's outside counsel before initiating litigation. It took place in a quiet conference room at a downtown law office. Ryan did not attend. His attorneys arrived carrying several thick binders and appeared confident that another routine discussion would end the matter. Margaret remained calm throughout the meeting. She did not accuse anyone of hiding evidence. She simply placed the corporate index on the table beside the restructuring documents and asked a straightforward question. Could you please provide the separately archived final execution page identified under archive reference FTR 48? The attorneys exchanged brief glances before one of them answered that they were still reviewing historical records. Margaret nodded politely. Do you dispute that the official corporate index identifies such a page? After a brief pause, the attorney admitted that the index did reference it. Then has anyone actually seen the original? Silence filled the room for several long seconds. Finally, another attorney explained that they currently possessed scanned restructuring documents and certified copies, but had not yet located the separately archived original execution page. Margaret thanked them, gathered her files, and ended the meeting without another word. As soon as we stepped into the elevator, she looked at me and quietly said, "Now we know what they do not have." I still refused to celebrate. What if they find it tomorrow? Margaret smiled slightly. Then they will produce it immediately. If they do not, the question becomes why. Within 48 hours, our legal team filed a formal action requesting judicial review of the corporate transfer process. The lawsuit did not claim that my signatures had been forged. It did not accuse Ryan of fabricating documents. Instead, it focused on one narrow legal issue: whether the permanent transfer of founder control had ever been legally completed under the company's own governing agreement. That distinction surprised many people. Even some attorneys following the case expected arguments about fraud or deception. Margaret ignored all of them. Never argue 5 issues when one decisive issue is enough, she reminded me. Discovery began quickly. Both sides exchanged thousands of pages of records. Every email, board resolution, meeting minute, and corporate filing passed through teams of lawyers. Weeks later, the company's records manager gave sworn testimony explaining how official corporate documents were archived. Under questioning, she confirmed that every permanent founder transfer required an original execution page containing the controlling founder's handwritten signature before the transaction could be finalized in the official record. Margaret then asked the simplest question of the entire proceeding. Did you personally archive such an original execution page in this case? The records manager hesitated. She reviewed several files placed in front of her. Then she answered quietly. No. Margaret continued. Have you ever personally seen an original execution page bearing Mr. Carter's handwritten signature, transferring permanent founder control? Another pause followed. No. My heart pounded, but Margaret showed no emotion. She simply introduced the company's own archive index listing the missing page and asked whether anyone had ever provided it to her department. The answer remained the same. No. That testimony changed the atmosphere overnight. Reporters who had ignored the lawsuit suddenly began asking questions. Investors requested clarification. Members of the board quietly hired independent counsel. Ryan still appeared publicly, insisting the company remained focused on business and describing the litigation as a routine legal disagreement. Yet for the first time since I had been locked out of my own office, certainty had disappeared from his voice. Late that evening, Margaret called me after reviewing another production of electronic records. Her tone remained steady, but I could hear restrained excitement beneath every word. Ethan, she said, we finally understand what happened. You signed dozens of restructuring documents exactly as Ryan expected. But the one page that legally completed the transfer was never signed by you because it was never placed in front of you. Everything that followed depended on everyone assuming that page existed. It never did. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic outbursts, no raised voices, and no surprise witnesses bursting through the doors at the last second. Real corporate litigation did not work that way. Instead, every word mattered because every word became part of the official record. Ryan entered surrounded by attorneys and greeted several board members with the same confident smile I had seen in countless magazine interviews. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the room. He did not look angry. He looked certain. That certainty reminded me of the day he handed me the restructuring folder. He still believed every document was on his side. Margaret quietly arranged our exhibits without showing the slightest emotion. Before the hearing began, she leaned toward me and spoke softly. Today is not about proving he is dishonest. Today is about proving the company failed to satisfy its own rules. The judge opened the proceedings by summarizing the narrow issue before the court. The dispute was not whether restructuring documents existed. It was whether the permanent transfer of founder control had been legally completed under the company's governing agreement. Ryan's lead attorney presented first. He displayed copies of the restructuring package, board resolutions, shareholder approvals, and pages containing my genuine signatures. Everything appeared orderly and professional. He argued that I had knowingly participated in the restructuring and that months of corporate decisions had already relied upon those completed transactions. Several people in the courtroom nodded as the presentation continued. If someone had walked into the room without knowing the details, Ryan's position appeared overwhelmingly strong. Then Margaret stood. She did not challenge a single signature shown on the screen. She did not accuse anyone of forging documents. Instead, she projected one page from the original operating agreement onto the courtroom monitor. Article 12 appeared exactly as it had years earlier when Ryan and I first created the company. She slowly read the critical sentence requiring the original written signature of the controlling founder on the final execution page, retained within the official corporate record before permanent control could transfer. She paused, allowing every person in the room to read the language for themselves. Then she introduced the company's official archive index, identifying the required execution page under its specific archive reference. Finally, she submitted every response received from opposing counsel acknowledging that the page had never been located. The judge leaned forward. "Counsel," he asked Ryan's attorney, "can your clients produce the original execution page required under Article 12? A long silence followed. Ryan's legal team quietly searched through binders they had already reviewed dozens of times. One attorney whispered to another. Papers moved across the table. Minutes passed. Finally, the lead attorney stood and admitted that despite extensive searches, the original execution page had not been located. The judge asked a second question. "Can you establish that such a page was ever executed by Mr. Carter?" Again, there was silence. Ryan shifted in his chair for the first time that morning. The confidence that had followed him into the courtroom began fading behind an expression I had never seen on his face before. Margaret then called the corporate records manager, who repeated under oath that she had never received or archived an original execution page bearing my handwritten signature. The forensic document examiner confirmed that while my signatures appeared throughout the restructuring packet, no evidence existed showing I had ever signed the separate execution page required to finalize the permanent transfer. Margaret ended her presentation with one sentence that echoed through the silent courtroom. A transaction cannot become legally complete simply because everyone assumes the final step occurred. The judge requested a brief recess before returning with his preliminary findings. He explained that the governing agreement drafted by the founders themselves established mandatory requirements for transferring founder control. Based on the evidence presented, substantial questions existed regarding whether those requirements had ever been satisfied. Until those questions were resolved, the validity of the transfer itself could not simply be presumed. He ordered immediate preservation of all remaining corporate records, suspended additional transfers of controlling interests, and scheduled expedited proceedings to determine the legal status of every action taken under the disputed authority. The courtroom remained completely silent as his words settled over everyone present. Ryan slowly turned toward his attorneys, searching their faces for reassurance that never came. For months, he had believed the signatures inside his folder guaranteed victory. Now everyone in the room understood the truth. The signatures he had relied upon were never the ones that mattered. The months that followed changed far more than the outcome of a lawsuit. After reviewing the complete record, the court concluded that the permanent transfer of founder control had never been legally completed because the mandatory execution requirements established in the operating agreement were never satisfied. Without the original execution page bearing my handwritten signature, the transaction that removed me from control could not stand under the very rules Ryan and I had written together years earlier. The board moved quickly once the legal uncertainty disappeared. Independent investigators reviewed every major corporate action taken after my removal. Investors demanded transparency. Several financing agreements required immediate renegotiation because they had been approved under disputed authority. The directors who had once accepted the restructuring without question now admitted they had relied on legal assumptions that turned out to be incomplete. Ryan resigned before the final corporate vote could remove him. His resignation letter described the decision as being in the best interest of the company, but everyone understood the real reason. The confidence that had carried him through television interviews and conference stages had vanished. I never celebrated his departure. There was nothing satisfying about watching a friendship of 20 years end inside legal filings and corporate minutes. The greatest loss had happened long before the courtroom. It happened the moment trust became something that could be traded for power. Reporters called constantly, asking whether I planned to return as chief executive officer. Investors wanted reassurance. Employees wanted certainty. Even members of the board expected me to reclaim the office that had once belonged to me. I surprised all of them by declining the position. During those difficult months, I had learned something I never understood while chasing growth and quarterly reports. A company can survive almost anything except the loss of its values. I no longer wanted to rebuild inside a place where trust had been broken so completely. Instead, I accepted a consulting role during the transition period to stabilize ongoing projects, protect employees, and help customers experience as little disruption as possible. After that responsibility ended, I quietly walked away. Claire asked whether I regretted leaving. I looked at the empty office one final time before handing my security badge to the receptionist. No, I answered. I built a company once. I can build another. Character is much harder to rebuild than business. 6 months later, I rented a modest office not much larger than the apartment where Ryan and I had once started our first dream together. There were no expensive conference rooms, no polished marble lobby, and no headlines announcing a grand opening. Just 12 desks, a whiteboard covered with ideas, and a small group of people who believed integrity was worth protecting even when nobody was watching. One by one, former employees began reaching out. Some apologized for believing the public story. Others admitted they had been afraid to contact me while everything remained uncertain. I held no resentment toward them. Fear often makes decent people choose silence. What mattered was what they chose once they finally knew the truth. Several eventually joined the new company, not because I offered larger salaries, but because they wanted to work in a place where trust was treated as an asset instead of a slogan. On the first anniversary of opening our new office, my daughter walked beside me as we unveiled a simple sign near the entrance. It did not display impressive financial numbers or ambitious corporate promises. It carried only 3 words. Integrity comes first. She smiled and asked whether that was our new company motto. I shook my head. No, I told her. It is our first rule. Sometimes people ask me what the biggest lesson from this experience was. They expect me to talk about contracts, lawsuits, or corporate governance. Those things matter, but they are not the lesson I remember most. I remember a college student offering another student the last slice of pizza because friendship seemed more valuable than winning something small. I remember believing that loyalty could never be questioned. And I remember discovering that the strongest protection any business can have is not hidden inside complicated legal language. It is found in the courage to verify even the people you trust the most. A missing signature restored my future, but it also reminded me that success built without integrity is only temporary. The company I lost gave me a career. The company I built afterward gave me peace. And in the end, that turned out to be the greater victory.